Hi, everyone. Welcome to the OCTO Speaker Series. My name is Idan, and I run the Developer Experiences Research Team in GitHub's Office of the CTO. We hold these Speaker Series meetups once or twice a month, and every episode tries to dig into the future of software with a speaker that can shed some light on where we're going and what's going on today to help decipher that future. OCTO's charter is to look at the future of developer experiences. And it's easy in this role to think in terms of what can be built or things that can be used. When my team sits down to talk about what to pursue next, that's the easiest place to start brainstorming. Like, wouldn't it be cool if there was a thing that did X? But the second question that we ask is always a human one. What's the behavior that we want to affect? What's the human impact? If we make things that aren't changing behaviors, then there's nothing durable about whatever we're doing. And that's a smell that we're barking up the wrong trees. It's the second question that I think about a lot because it helps us keep our sights on the horizon and stay out of the tooling trap. Tools come and go, but humans are always going to be a part of software projects. It's also relatively easy to think about how tools shape behavior. Tools hopefully have some kind of affordance that tell you how they're meant to be used. They guide you into the right motions and behaviors. If I think about a hammer, that affordance is obvious. I have a handle. It's about the right size for a hand. It feels better if I hold it the right way than if I hold it anywhere else. The hammer teaches me how to use it. The real question is, what's the equivalent for things that are not tools? If I think about communities as shaping human behavior, then what's the equivalent concept there? I can't look at a community and say, that's where I can hold on to a handle. It's not that communities can't define affordances or guide people into the right motions. It's that it's less obvious how to do that. Even if you do figure it out in one community, it's difficult to transfer that kind of success from one community to another. This is a topic that's squarely in OCTO's domain of interest already, but I think it's particularly topical to my team right now because of where we work. Like it or not, an overwhelming number of software communities exist through GitHub. If we can find ways to make community success a tiny bit easier, then we could be a rising tide to many boats. And nobody flat out has the answers to this, but we're all developing on top of a mountain of other people's code. And if we want that mountain to be stable for each of us to be able to reach a little further, then we have to wrestle with these sticky, uncomfortable questions about communities and how to make them work. We can't keep building better parsers and web frameworks and whatever and expect them to paper over what are fundamentally questions about how humans interact. As the world of software onboards more practitioners, making communities succeed is a really urgent question. And I also think that there's room for some pointed looks at what the forges of software like GitHub can do to make these communities flourish. How can we encourage healthy growth of not just contributors, but maintainers, the people who have an interest in the project beyond the code? What even constitutes a community? What constitutes success? And how do we transfer successful patterns from one community to another? So today I'm delighted to welcome Sumana Harihareswara to the OCTO Speaker Series. She's the founder of Changeset Consulting and has been active in a variety of open source communities for years. Her work on the Python packaging ecosystem is particularly relevant because many software communities are defined by the packaging infrastructure that makes that community possible. If you've ever built software from source on a POSIX-like system using the configure, make, install dance, then you've benefited from her efforts. The autoconf project was stuck without releases for 8 years until she got involved, and she's writing a book on the matter called Getting Unstuck: Advice for Open Source Projects. She has a wealth of both personal and professional experience to bring to bear on that second question: how do we make communities successful? As with every episode of the speaker series, I want to remind everybody that we have a code of conduct published on our discussion repo, and we care about it. Sticking to a code of conduct while discussing JavaScript is relatively easy, but here we're going to be talking about communities and behaviors and people and humans. So more so than previous episodes, please be thoughtful, please be kind, and please listen to the moderators. We want a good talk, and we want hard questions, and we want everyone to feel great participating in the discussion, even when we're discussing these hard things. I've also started a GitHub discussions thread to collect questions at the link below. And we'll also be looking at Twitch chat. We'll come back to these after Sumana's talk. And I'll bring these questions up in discussion, so please don't be shy. Without further ado, welcome Sumana.
Hey there, Idan. Thank you very much for having me. And I hope at some point that I can also come back and give a purely comedic performance where I make jokes about, for instance, other licenses that we could possibly bring into the system, like the wedding gift license, where you can use it for free for a year, but would it kill you to send a thank you note?
Okay.
I also do some amount of stand-up, but I will not have nearly as many jokes today as I wish. I hope that's okay with you, Idan.
That's totally fine. Thank you so much for coming on. We're really excited to have you here. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I'd also like to thank and acknowledge, since I live in New York City, the Matinakok and Maspeth people on whose ancestral land I stand, the African people whose bones were buried unmarked in the city's foundations, and the involuntary and exploited labor of people from every land which helped to make New York City great. I'm here today to talk about open source as an industry and what it would look like if it were healthy. Except I can only talk about healthier, not healthy. And I am going to share some stories, some composite visions of what healthier open source would look like. I am going to do that. But first I'm going to take 5 or 6 minutes to ask, well, what would healthy include? What would it look like if open source were healthy? Well, literally, the people would be healthier, right? We would have healthcare for everybody. I live in the United States where we do not have universal health care. Universal health care in the United States and in a bunch of other countries would make open source healthier, not just because it would mean that friends of mine would have an easier time getting to see the doctors, but also, at least in the United States, the need for reliable health care and health insurance causes a tremendous number of open source contributors to have to take full-time jobs with employers where they're working either 0% or a very small percent of the time on open source, and they're working most of the time on proprietary software, and then they have to do their open source just sort of in nights and weekends and things like that. And if you look at, for instance, Freexian, which is an effort where Debian developers club together and get sponsorship money so they can each spend a certain number of hours each month consulting on really important parts of Debian software and infrastructure, a lot of those people who can take advantage of that are in Europe, are in places where they can do consulting. They can switch back and forth between full-time employment and consulting a lot more easily because healthcare isn't a question. If we had universal health care, we would more easily be able to recruit programmers to work on underproduced, under-supported infrastructural work like Debian. We'd be able to crowdfund people, and we'd be able to free people as well to crowdfund short periods of work doing innovative research that might not lead to near-term products and startups and things like that. Another thing that would have healthier open source is one of its outcomes would be high quality, universal early childhood childcare so that parents could more easily concentrate on their work if they are consulting and if they are working outside the home. And if there were centers that provided regular daycare for working parents and also had extra capacity for drop-ins and overnights, then in case, there's some deadline, some fire breaks out, that parent could participate and could make sure that they had the time to make the right decision instead of the quick decision because somebody else was helping take care of the kids. Another thing that would make open source healthier would be a hell of a lot more direct funding for open source infrastructure and for research and development from the nonprofit sector and from rich universities. And I'm going to get into the weeds just a little bit right now on basically tax policy, but it's actually important. Right now, there are lots of rich universities and nonprofit foundations who have trillions of dollars of assets in the United States alone. And some of those do spend a little bit of money funding, sometimes through grants, open source software, open source projects, open source infrastructure. It would make a huge difference if nonprofit foundations and rich universities and donor-advised funds, which is a new kind of construct that exists, actually paid out more of their assets those trillions of dollars that they have to fund open source software work. And right now, if you look up the 5% payout rule, basically most of these foundations, at least in the United States, only have to make charitable expenditures that equal or exceed 5% of their endowment each year. And as these endowments go up and up, often by more than 5% per year, that means they're accumulating money instead of spending it out. The nonprofit AF blog suggesting there's going to be some links in the notes that I hope Idana is putting into the Twitch chat right now. Donor-advised funds have grown even more rapidly in number and assets, and DAFs have no legal mandate to pay out anything each year. So donors take tax breaks immediately when they transfer their wealth to DAFs, but they're not those DAFs are not actually legally required to actually distribute those funds to nonprofits. So there's a lot of very wealthy people who use DAFs and private foundations for tax advantages, and there are, as I said, some grant programs that fund work in open source from some of these, but it's very competitive, and it doesn't have to be. The money ought to be there. So closing that loophole, also funding the IRS to actually enforce its rules, would also free up money for government investment in infrastructure, including healthcare, climate resilience, education, and open source, all of which would make open source healthier. The IRS enforcement thing, I can get into that at a later time. And also, and you probably knew once you started hearing me talk that I was going to get to this, a universal basic income or a minimum income would free so many people to work on what they want to work on. And then if institutions, including companies, wanted to pay people extra to make an enterprise thing happen, then they could. And you know, as long as I'm being a real visionary and asking for things that feel impossible, open source being healthy, a healthy world would be one in which I could retcon, backport some of the inclusion and support that we ought to offer everyone into the past, the not so recent and sometimes the recent past, so that we aren't missing as many people in open source and in this industry who ought to be working with us right now. So this would be a universe in which 14 years ago, harassers didn't force user experience expert Kathy Sierra to end her entire career in technology, and she's only briefly returned. This would be a universe in which 7 years ago, a now departed co-founder of GitHub didn't act so inappropriately to the first female developer and designer, Julianne Horvath, that he forced her out of the company. And this would also be a universe in which some of my friends are still alive, like Aaron Swartz and Noreen Plunkett and Igal Koshevoy. And I'm not going to share the stories of those 5 people in detail because I didn't put a content note on this talk, and I don't want to sideswipe you emotionally more than I already have. But we have a bunch of work to do to build the infrastructure of inclusion along with the digital and the financial and the legal and the other social infrastructure that we need to build to grow the health of open source. That's the long term. And it is our job as residents of the universe to do our bit on those things. But in the meantime, let's talk about some things that are a little bit closer. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories of some different futures. These are maybe things that could happen in the next 2 to 10 years, and they require smaller changes in the world. And after I tell you each of these stories, I'll tell you what we would need to get there. New tools, easier ways to hire certain kinds of services, easier ways to share resources with others, and so on. So, first, a story of local innovation. Let's say that this is a future in which the Australian Data Science Education Institute has made more of an impact in the world of people who teach science and technology and engineering, because they know that real projects give real motivation, which means that if you want people to learn how to do things like data science, instead of giving them a toy project, give them real data to work with, something where if they work with it, it's going to make a real difference in their neighborhood or to their group. So let's say in your city, a local education agency or nonprofit thinks, well, that's a great idea, and they start an initiative to help people do project-based learning to help improve their programming and data science skills. And so they work with local activists to come up with a bunch of data science questions, and they pop those opportunities open. They publicize what these questions are, especially to local institutions where people are trying to do project-based learning. And so there's, a bunch of those. Maybe the first idea that comes to mind for you is, let's say, Montessori schools or homeschoolers, right? There are schools and unschools where the curricula include independent study and project options. People want to learn that way. But another group that might be really interested in this might be underdog devs or the last mile. And these are groups where formerly incarcerated software engineers and software engineers who are still imprisoned work on prisoner reentry through retraining to work in the software industry. Or maybe the local data science institutes and the local activists could reach out to retraining programs for returning veterans who want to go from the military into industry. So this local nonprofit, the education nonprofit, they hire a consultant for some initial project management and open source training so that the few people, the few Montessori kids and ex-prisoners doing reentry and veterans, the few people who said, that project, who are working together, can get some help from a part-time contractor who helps run the project and who helps them learn how to do open source. And there were a bunch of different project ideas, but this project, the one that these particular 5 people got interested in, had to do with AEDs. These people all live in a particular city, and every person has a heart, but sometimes hearts go a little wonky, right? Now, automated external defibrillators are an amazing technology. On average, when a person in the United States calls 911 because someone suffered cardiac arrest, emergency medical responders get to the scene in 8 to 12 minutes. But for people suffering cardiac arrest, for every minute that defibrillation is delayed, the chance of survival goes down about 7 to 10%. But automated external defibrillators, which are paddles that anyone can use, and you put them on someone's chest, and if it's a normal heart rhythm, they don't shock. But if it's the kind of heart rhythm that could be shocked back into normal, then it says, okay, I'm going to do the shock now. And bystanders, even untrained ones who use AEDs on victims, can save lives. And so that's why there are a bunch of these public access defibrillation programs all around the world to make AEDs more accessible in more places, in train stations and police stations and gyms and swimming pools and some of these franchise coffee shops and things like that. But a ton of people do not know where their nearest AED is. I bet you don't know. And there are some neighborhoods within any given city that are probably AED deserts. So where are public access AEDs, and what's the distribution of them? And is there a desert? Is there a place where we could put a few in and they would really maximize how many people would be able to get to them in just a few minutes? That's the question that they start asking. So they need to learn some things about geographic information systems and playing with CSVs and all that stuff. This project manager helps them out and is able to spin up a new project quickly with a particular template of issues and labels and so on that's appropriate for a local project with a few new learners. They're able to use sort of a cookie cutter to recopy useful configuration settings, issue templates, labels, milestones, who has what privileges, and so on. It's very turnkey. They don't have to spend a bunch of time making it themselves. And another tool that helps them as they grow this new project is an automated way to say, hey, we want to capture this decision, this design rationale. So the project manager used this turnkey tooling to create a minimal read the docs website, some documentation for the project. And in an issue or a pull request, if one of the project collaborators mentions a bot, then it makes a pull request that adds a markdown export of that discussion into a work in progress draft pull request that, if merged, would go into the read the docs section, architectural history. So the manager can lightly edit that and put it in the history of these set of design choices that they made, so that when new folks come along, they can understand why the features and the structure are what they are. And this consultant manager is only part-time, but just in case there's suddenly a flood of new people who are interested, maybe because they get featured on the news or something like that, this part-time manager can keep up using a notification feed, a dashboard of what are people saying, what tickets are experiencing a big spike of comments in the thread, is there a fire to be aware of. These are overview tools, not just, oh, here's a bunch of individual notifications. These are monitoring tools for monitoring the flow and the workload. And it's unlikely for this project that anything like this will happen, but it gives everyone peace of mind. So they learn, right? These 5 volunteers, these 5 learners, plus their part-time helper, paid for by the educational nonprofit, learn. They do something that's not innovative, right? There might be 50 other projects just like this around the world, but this is theirs, and they made it, and they understand it. And it's important to them, and it helps them get some information that they use to talk with local city council members and agencies, to get some more public access AEDs placed into neighborhoods that don't have as many, and then spread the word that they're available. And then once they're done with that, a bunch of them say, you know what we should work on next is cross-referencing transit and library hours to see who has a really hard time getting via transit to their local library while it's open. And they realize that they probably don't need the consultant anymore. They know how to run the project. And if they find that they do want a little extra expertise to help them out, they can reach out to an institution that this consultant introduced them to. And it protects freedom in concrete ways. So if there's some company that sues them for breaking some patent that they didn't even know about, this institution will help support and protect and defend them. It also provides platform support to help developers do their work better. It offers financial infrastructure in case they want a place to put donations and a means to spend them. If they need some architectural guidance or code review once in a while, someone can drop by and or some tips on project management. And in general, this institution works on recruiting new people into the free software movement and retaining them, which has now happened. So think about what's different in this story compared to our world. One thing that jumps out to me, and meant not to you, is I think this story has better collaboration on technology projects, creating, funding, handing them off, providing infrastructure, and so on, among different kinds of institutions than we have in our world, including nonprofits, a for-profit like this consultant, different kinds of educational institutions, and so on. There's a lot more fluid collaboration, including among the different nonprofits, some of which happen on perhaps more of an educational rhythm, like the school calendar, and some of which don't. Another is, this is not, oh, let's fund a hackathon. Oh, let's fund a weekend, hack day with a contest of some kind. This is not about that, right? Funding instead has gone into infrastructure so that over the course of possibly months, this project can succeed. So that's not just the paying for the manager, but also paying possibly for the forge, because this forge has features that are appropriate to this group, including possibly people who are under 13. This is also an example of how an ecology of consultancies can change the interactions among volunteers and companies and other institutions, because in this universe, it's really easy to hire an open source project manager, either a freelancer or one from kind of a temp agency, who can help people start to run a project and help them learn what they need to learn about open source engineering and contribution. Hi, my name is Sumana, and I run Changeset Consulting, and you can hire me for this sort of thing, but it would be great if there were a lot more institutions like mine. And that institution that I mentioned at the end, there are a few that do a bunch of those different things, but I don't think there is one institution that does all of those things, especially just for little informal groups that might not have any particular legal entity. Finally, let's talk about the tooling that I mentioned, right? Which goes to what Idan mentioned in the introduction. So there's the ability to use this cookie cutter approach to create, let's say, a repository or project, whatever you might call it, whose digital workflow and scaffolding is optimized to support one particular purpose. There's the help for a part-time maintainer by giving them not just notifications of individual events, but monitoring, right? They're like the system administrator, but not of a digital system, but of a social system, right? Monitoring for the spikes and fires to give them that overview. And then, and this bit of tooling I really is close to my heart, the ease of capturing the design rationale. If you ever read the excellent book, Making Software, What Really Works and Why We Believe It, which is a collection of research about what works in software engineering, you'll see the number one thing that a new contributor to a project needs and has a really hard time getting is the design rationale behind bits of decisions. Why did they do it this way, and why did they do it at all, right? They're looking through code. Well, was it to a deadline? Was it to fix a bug or work around a bug? Was somebody trying out a new framework for fun, or what? Because that totally happens. Tools to capture this as you go can surface it at a level that's higher and easier to read than commit logs and comments when you're trying to get the architectural history of the project. And this also then helps you explain to other people who might especially be contributing in ways that are not code, including stakeholders from governments. So that's the first story. Next, I want to tell you a story about a person who becomes a user and then a contributor and then a co-maintainer of a project. Which happens now, but probably less like this than in this story. Paula started at the DMV as a data entry clerk. And she thought maybe that was all that she was going to end up doing. And, well, I guess that's okay. But in this universe, municipalities and states are forming consortia. Different states will sometimes join a consortium to club together and fund an open source replacement for not that great software that a vendor has sold to them in the past, proprietary software. And different departments of motor vehicles in different United States mostly do the same thing. So they realized, well, why don't we get together and make some DMV software? So there's a consortium of 8 states that are pooling their money to make this open source replacement for their current proprietary vendor systems, and the code name for this new software project is Motorhead for now. They're thinking of changing it. And Paula, through her unionized benefits, gets, if she wants it, training in this new piece of software and a chance to give feedback, right? She's going to be one of the users of this piece of software, so she gets asked, hey, do you want to be one of the people who tries it out and gives feedback? And so she tries it out. There are things she likes, there are things that she thinks could be improved, and through the consortium and the DMV and also her union, she comes to understand that one of the things that could happen is that she could actually help fix some of the things that she doesn't like. So through, again, partly in-house, partly through the consortium, and partly through the professional development benefits of her job, she starts training up on how to contribute to open source software. There is a textbook, and there's training material that helps her learn some basic engineering skills, and she really loves being able to pop the hood and fix stuff that was annoying her. Also, she doesn't have to fight about inclusive assumptions being made from the start, both about the software's administrators and users and about the kind of data that they're holding about individual people whose data passes through the system. From the very start, it is assumed that, well, sometimes people change their names, including people who administer the system. Some people identify outside the gender binary. Sometimes individuals die, and it's important to make room for that in the various data structures and workflows, including, again, people who administer the system. Sometimes people get harassed, and so it's important when it comes to information that's mostly public to be able to move things sometimes from private to public or vice versa, and be respectful of people's needs around that, and to allow users to block harassers from contacting them. All of these are things, these are fights that Paula doesn't even have to have, that's already built into the engineering assumptions. So Paula is able to switch into a role where she's doing a lot less data entry and a lot more IT and contribution as one of the contributions that this particular DMV makes to the consortium work. And she learns more about what it's like to work together in a project like this. And she finds out that the DMV offers, as a professional development benefit, a course offered by a training firm where she could learn to be one of the leaders, one of the maintainers of an open source project. So she thinks that would be pretty cool. So she goes in on this course, and there's a textbook, and there's also a playground, basically a sort of sandbox, where she can learn about issue management and release management, etc. And there's a trainer who takes her through exercises and assesses how she does on those things and gives her feedback about how she does. So she learns in a safe environment how to take inventory of a project, clean out a bug tracker, clean out the old unreproducible bugs, look at a bunch of feature requests and prioritize them, talk with users and find out more about what they need, deprecate an API, run a release, including navigating feature freeze and code freeze, run a meeting, make a budget, and so on. And then when the people who are working on this project say, oh, great, you're done with that course, come on, why don't we make you an apprentice maintainer, she's able to work and participate in a way that makes her feel safe because she's backstopped, right? There's a safety net, and that comes with the tooling. Certainly it's the support, it's the emotional support from other people and their willingness to help, but also the tools on that forge, oh, they help her so much, right? If she wants to write a reply to something, but she isn't super sure about it, built into the platform is a way for her to share that note with her colleague and say, hey, could you check this and maybe edit it? And then as soon as that person approves it or edits and approves, it lands into the repository with her name on it, right? It's just a way of getting some editing and polishing help and approval from her colleague. So she can gate her reviews, replies, and emails on someone else's approval. Or she can shadow them and watch them make a decision about how to reply to something. Or they can, somebody can help her by ghostwriting with her. Similarly, one of the ways that you save time and sort of save your emotional energy when you're replying to patches and pull requests or issues or what have you is with saved replies, saved responses. And in this particular forge, it's very easy to share those with your fellow maintainers so that everybody can benefit from the hard-won wisdom of how do you write this quite the right way, and it'll have all the important links in it. And as she grows more confident and doesn't need that scaffolding as much anymore, and she's monitoring the community, well, I don't like to use the word community most of the time for these projects because it's not a group of people who know each other and actually take care of each other, but as she's monitoring her constituencies, right, the users and stakeholders and so on, there's a dashboard that helps her notice things that aren't happening that should. It's not just notifications of things that are happening. It's also, for instance, hey, that seemed like it was an important conversation and it stopped and it's gone stale and quiet, so that she can take a look and see, is it that it should be marked resolved, or do we need to push and rephrase this so that we can get the conversation going again? Or let's say there's a person who was contributing and participating regularly and has now gone quiet. She can check in on what's happening with that person. Along the way, as she's learning to use and contribute to and then co-maintain Motorhead, she goes to a conference. And then the next year she sprints at it and works with people during a hack week. And then the next year she speaks. She gives a talk at that conference. This is a conference that's hosted by a free and open source software organization. This is actually the organization that lobbied for the procurement rule change in state government that allowed this consortium to happen. And this org has a really wide purview. So there's a lot of cross-pollination at this conference. People are working on the technology side, but they're also working on all the other things it takes to liberate people with technology. There's talks and workshops about fundraising and money management and effective public speaking and writing. People are planning together about how we liberate users by giving them high quality free software platforms and apps and services. Some people are sharing compelling new visions and articulations for the free software movement as circumstances change, right? New metaphors, new fronts to fight in. There's summits by people who are lobbying to change more procurement rules and also educational curricula standards around the US and around the world. And there are efforts, there are many sort of hack weeks and sprints and workshops and hallway conversations about growing the number and types of volunteers who contribute to crucial free software projects and making strategic choices to improve free software infrastructure and recruiting and mentoring successor leaders like her. You get the idea. Oh, and no one harasses her at this conference, which she does not notice, because it's easy not to notice the absence of a thing like that. So Paula helps get this new system production ready, and it replaces the old proprietary system, and she makes and implements a really big decision after that, which is that a project can have, or rather an instance, right, of Motorhead can handle beginning to trust another instance from another state and implement business logic, so we can handle both sides of a person moving from one state to another, so that Motorhead can coordinate automatic re-registration of a person, new license, new voter registration, and so on. And Paula's now a trusted expert within the consortium, and people ask whether she'll come join a worker co-op that offers migration services for the various US states that are deciding to switch to Motorhead, and that would be an interesting change, but she really doesn't like to travel, so she's thinking about it. So what's different in this universe? Again, because I think so much about institutions, the consortia, right? More than having all these procurement rule changes for public government-funded agencies, so that people from different municipalities and states and so on can get together and create a consortium. That's not happening nearly enough right now. My spouse, Leonard Richardson, works on an effort called Libraries Simplified, where public libraries in lots of places can join together to make lending ebooks easier and use open source and open standards to save money and control their own destiny. Also, the worker co-ops. Again, some of these exist, but they're not nearly as common as they could be. Another thing that is not as much the case as I would like it to be is having those inclusive assumptions from the start. Now, in this case, because this is software that has to do with personal data at the Department of Motor Vehicles, okay, maybe it's more likely that a lot of those inclusive assumptions would be baked in. But also the next WordPress, the next Git, the next Tor, ideally in healthy open source, they also don't have these perceptual gaps about who uses it and what their needs are likely to be. Consultants and training companies exist in this universe that provide training on how to be a contributor and how to be a maintainer. There is not that much of that right now, and it's a big gap that makes it harder for us to grow the leadership that we need for successors in free and open source software leadership. So I've actually written a bit of a spec, which I think there's a link to, I hope, on Twitch. Now, for the software, we will need to have real interactive sandbox training to teach maintainership skills without someone having to learn everything from a real life project. And I am working on basically the textbook on how to come into an existing free software project and become a co-maintainer and help get the project unstuck if it needs to. And you can actually download a sample of that right now for free. Some tooling. This, again, there's tooling to help maintainers share the burden. There's tooling to help people teach each other or cross-check each other's work, and tooling to notice the dog that didn't bark. Again, this is almost the converse of what I said in the previous story about notifications, right? What a great conference that sounds like. Now, I haven't been to an in-person conference for more than a year, so maybe I've just made up a Disneyland in my head of, oh, this is the conference that I want to go to. But this is inheriting from the legacy of Open Source Bridge and Open Source and Feelings and OSCON, and also something that you can get sometimes with an Allied Media Conference and Siegel and LibrePlanet. I just want like a big combination of all these things. And the institution that hosts that, I think it doesn't exist. I think there's different institutions that do a lot of those, including the Wikimedia Foundation, for instance, but yeah, we need more of it. I don't know whether it should be in one house or a bunch of different ones, but at least right now, for instance, the Free Software Foundation is not that. And the last story that I'll share with you is a story of a legacy project that fails, except I don't know if it is actually a failure. Maybe it's just an ending. So Sean is the maintainer of a Drupal Instagram integration. It helps you reuse photos from Instagram into Drupal. And Sean maintains a lot of stuff, right? And it's made somewhat easier by the fact that there are user groups, user councils, who can help him a bit with some money and also some help with things that don't require him, right? User to user help in the forums and cleaning up the bug tracker and things like that. But even so, you know, it takes work as these APIs change and things like that. So Sean has taken on more and more, and he realizes one day that he's feeling a little more burned out, feeling kind of exhausted. And a friend of his, instead of sending him some list of 10 productivity hacks, does perhaps a kinder thing and actually takes some time to sit down with him and do a responsibility audit. Just big list of what are all the open source things that you're responsible for right now. And there's a lot on that list. And Sean realizes that this Instagram Drupal integration is just not where he wants to be putting his time. He needs to concentrate on a fewer things that have a higher priority to him. And so at the next Solstice, he uses the open source tradition that has arisen that twice a year at the solstices, there's a responsibility amnesty day, which is the day when you can just say, hey, I can't keep doing this anymore, so I'm putting it down. And everyone understands. So he does that at the next solstice. And his user council basically says, well, crap. Okay. People recognize that every open source project has a life cycle that includes an end, and that is natural, that at some point every project is going to come to an end. There's a fairly easy governance and decision mechanism that this user stakeholder council can use to confer and say, well, what are we going to do about this? And if they come to no decision, then the null/default that's going to happen is that after they fail to come to a decision during the election and discussion and deliberation period, then, well, the project's just going to go read-only, and that's just how it is. And so they assess their ability and collective desire to maintain it themselves or hire or support a new maintainer, and in this case, they don't want to do that. Not enough people want to contribute enough in order to make that happen, because enough of them think, well, in the next 5 years or so, I'll be moving off either Drupal or Instagram. But they do want to use their collective power to make an easier migration path for themselves. And so they hire, as a one-time and smaller cost, an end-of-life consultant. This person looks at their project, looks for competitors, updated descendants and replacements and forks, figures out maybe what it would take for possibly merging with another project, or how hard it's going to be to migrate people onto the various alternative services, and rustles up some consultancies to get prices so that now the users know what their options are for buying paid migration services, if that's what they want to do. And then, after all of that is done, after a little bit of time for everybody to kind of say their goodbyes on this one project, it's moved to archive mode. The code is moved to the software heritage dataset and moved off of the active area of platform, so people don't stumble on it and think, oh, I should use this, it's still maintained. No, it's clear that it's not. Everybody gets to concentrate on projects with a future, and Sean gets to lay down one of his burdens so that he can work on the things that he wants to. So what's different about this? I think one of the differences between this healthier open source industry and the one we're in is a general understanding that burnout is really serious and needs to be addressed through reduction of burdens and not just be more productive stuff. I'm really curious what people think of this Amnesty Day idea. In case it speaks to you, the solstices in 2021, at least in my area, are June 21st and December 21st. Take that as you will. Okay, so my spouse, Leonard, heard this idea and said, you know, this is the kind of thing that might not work in real life, because then we're squeezing together a bunch of sudden end of life, this is no longer maintained announcements onto just 2 days a year, and it might be hard for the users. And I said, but maybe this would be good, because then people would know to look out for those days, right? And say, oh, I got to check the day after. You tell me what you think. I think it would be great if there were better tooling for democratic governance, or at least, better shared resource stakeholder decision making built into the platforms that we use. And this is like the stuff that Shauna Gordon McKeon is working on with Glitzen and Concord, which I hope there will be some links shared in the Twitch. Also, Eleanor Ostrom's work, Louis Villa's work. This is all stuff that people have thought a lot about and written a lot about. But my point is that if this user council can exist and can make these kinds of deliberative decisions quickly and easily because it's built into the platform, that also makes reuse more possible, because then users, stakeholders don't think, I'm going to go reinvent the wheel because at least I know I'll have control over that, I'll have a voice in that. No, if people know that they can have a voice in the software that they use and that they can materially support it, then they know that they can actually reuse and stick with it, right? Now, a note about this tooling. This is possibly a kind of forge that's fundamentally different from the kind of forge, the kind of platform that another kind of project might need. An open source project that's made by a company that's just throwing the code over the wall, they don't need this governance stuff, right? Because they're the governance. You look at the open tech strategies, archetypes that they did with Mozilla, you think about how a business-to-business project is different from a mass market project, different from a specialty library, which is different from a trusted vendor. Nadia Egbal, and I have some thoughts about her book in case people want to talk about it, but she suggests, these categories of toy, club, federation, stadium, based on the ratios of users and contributors and user growth and contributor growth. So isn't it likely that they need really different things? And perhaps monopolies and monocultures in our platforms wouldn't help with this, right? Because they're kind of brittle and they get to be one size fits none. Another thing that happens in this story is the existence of this end-of-life consultant. As hard as it is to find consultants who can help you start a project, it's even harder to help consultants who will help you end one in a graceful way. If you look at what the Digital Impact Alliance has funded in the past in its strategic grants, they include product consolidation and managing upstream dependencies and downstream forks. It is a lot easier to find grants and funding and consultants to help you start a new project, as hard as that is, than to help find that kind of support to end a project that needs to stop gracefully. And it would be healthier for everyone if there were funded pathways and more hireable experts to help you end stuff and migrate people onto the next path. And finally, I just want to bring your attention to the software heritage approach, not just the code, but also conversations getting archived. So in conclusion, there's so much I haven't even touched on in this talk, right? I haven't even discussed in detail the problems with having a single proprietary point of failure for so much of the whole open source ecology, the importance of ease of import and export of all the artifacts associated with a project, including conversations where we actually make our engineering decisions, the kind of resilience that comes from having cross-dependent projects hosted on different forges. I haven't talked about copyleft and licenses and these new not really open source licenses that some companies are adopting, and that like venture capital funded platforms that get to outspend their rivals for years to gain market share and how that impacts these dynamics. I really have not talked enough about the international nature of open source software. And this goes all the way from the problem of conferences in the United States and Europe that are not accessible to people from many countries such as Nigeria because they can rarely get visas, all the way to our collective failure to use free software and free culture to help liberate people in Myanmar, China, and elsewhere. But I do know there's a lot to do to reduce the exhaustion and burnout and exploitation and the unreliability and underproduction of essential infrastructure and the waste of the open source software industry. And I hope I've at least sketched out some ways that these things could be improved and mitigated. And if we actually do make this field healthier, then people a generation from now will look back and say, wow, you got so much wrong. Right? They'll look at us the way we look at people from, ago. As a gag, people who have been doing open stuff for decades will send their less senior friends links to things that happened, right? To Left Pad and Heartbleed and the timeline of incidents and the firings of people unionizing at NPM, and so much more, and anticipate their they did what replies, the next generation of open source participants will look back at people like me and they will keenly observe what we missed, what we got wrong. This talk will be a laughingstock, right? Look at how late we were to form consortia and co-ops to support projects we cared about. Look at how slow we were to take advantage of these market opportunities for different kinds of training and consulting businesses. Look at where we were too complicit in the intersecting oppressions endemic to our society and too accepting of the ridiculously skewed tax policy of the United States, ridiculously skewed economics of the industry. Look at where we were just generally too much of our time. And that will mean that we've actually done reasonably well. So thank you to listening. Thank you to Mike Purnott and Nick Murphy for listening to some rehearsals, and to Leonard Richardson, Veit Heller, Sue Somerset, Lindsay Cooper, Julianne Horvath, and Marie Clemency for some discussions over the course of the past year or so that helped me with these ideas. Thank you for listening, and now I would welcome your questions. So Idan.
Thank you, Sumana. That was fantastic. And I would like to remind everybody that we have, I will put it on the screen. There we go. We have the OCTO discussion. I've already got a couple of questions going on in there.
Okay.
I wanted to ask a little bit about sort of, you talked about these overview or monitoring tools. I've struggled with my GitHub notifications for years, and
Sure.
everybody loves to hate on GitHub notifications, in particular, in a Goldilocks kind of way. You know, they're too many, too easy, not the right abstraction. You're talking here about notifications that are on a different scale, cutting across tooling and helping me get a sense for what the community wants. And I have sort of two related questions there. It sounds first like this is something one step removed from GitHub, because it looks at other sources of information, not just the commit stream, but also other kinds of interactions, not just conversations and pull requests. So the first question I have is, what are those other sources of information? And I think maybe related, like, you know, on the way to that, you highlighted what's active right now. You know, I'd love to talk a little bit more about that lens. Why is what's active so important? Because this implies this sort of like one-way signal, like, you know, I'm the leader, I must watch where my people are going so that I may lead them, you know. What about the opposite direction, you know, is how do we also give a return channel for maintainers to contributors as part of this, that it's not just about like, okay, what's going on, but also how do I help shape this, and how do we give these maintainers those tools? I know that's a whole big solution space, so we can break that down, but I'm curious what you think about those.
Sure. So I think that the first thing that you just said about what are these other sources of data that notifications, you know, that we might want to look at for a dashboard like this. I think a really good source for thinking about this is probably the CHAOSS project. That's CHAOSS. For people who don't know, this is a working group that is trying to really think in a very systematic way about metrics in open source software, and they are sometimes, you know, assisted by a consultancy called Bitergia that have thought a lot about what are all the different sources of information that you might want to grab, archive, analyze, reproduce, and so on from an open source software project. So, you know, there's stuff that happens on a platform like GitHub, or on a, you know, GitLab, Launchpad, SourceHut, and so on. And then there's conversation that happens because we exist on the internet. And so these are going to be, in some cases, social media notifications. Sometimes these will be individual personal email or Discord or Slack conversations. I think that places where you know people are talking about the project could widely vary to, you know, Reddit, email, individual, as I mentioned, Discords, and certainly Stack Overflow, for instance. So a thing that I think is probably a bit of a holy grail that I don't know whether it actually exists is something that helps me see all of that. I looked recently at the Hey, H-E-Y, email service and the various choices it makes about what it's doing to try to surface to you the conversations that you need to know about and the messages you need to know about, so that your inbox isn't just the world writable to-do list, right? And I think I struggled a lot emotionally with thinking of it, because I've been using email the way that most people have, right, for a great majority of my life, but rethinking the user control over what they see, and hooking in maybe things like Zapier to look at these other data sources might be interesting to try and create that. Okay, where is it? And then when you mention why, talk about this whole active thing, I think that the tell me about something that's gotten really active really does feel like a capacity to fight fires to me. It feels like a way to know in a way that isn't just, oh, I've gotten a bunch of individual notifications about this thing, but has a higher abstraction level. The question of, is this something that I need to step in on because tempers have gotten heated? Or because people are making a decision faster than they should. That is the intuition that I have about that on, sort of first thought about why do I think that's the case. I also think that it usually shouldn't just be something that one maintainer has to monitor, right? This might also make sense as a kind of a bat signal for people who care about a project, who can include curators and power users and stuff like that.
So, I mean, sort of built into that, though, is I think a problem that we're grappling with right now, which is that, like X doesn't scale, Sumana doesn't scale. There's only one, and for many contributors or many maintainers, if I were to walk up to them, I'm presuming that if I were to walk up to them and be like, "Here's some more tooling for you to monitor," they'd be like, "Oh no, go away." Because I don't have the bandwidth to get into it, and I think this maybe
you'll notice, by the way, Idon, that both of the maintainers that I talked about when I talked about this kind of tooling were both paid. And that's a huge difference as well, is that some of the maintainers who don't have time and are being burned out here, they are not being compensated for their labor, and so that's tough.
Well, it's difficult to work multiple jobs. This is not something new or specific to software. So absolutely, and I think it maybe ties in a little bit to the story you described around this new contributor persona, Paula, and apprenticeship. Because I think one of the problems that people have when contributing to open source software, or actually the other side of it is maintainers, is that contributors, come through, especially on popular projects, and are like, oh, I want to contribute. But to the maintainer, it's very difficult to sort out who's just passing through, they're interested, and maybe they lose interest as soon as they encounter the actual difficulty and need to chew on hard things, and who's actually going to be there for the long run. And without passing judgment about how people contribute, maintainers are people too, and the time that they spend cultivating new contributors, it's opportunity cost. They can't be in two conversations at once. They can't be reviewing PRs while they're holding somebody's hand. So if you're talking about wave a magic wand, you get to edit reality, and open source grows up in a slightly different fashion. What's different in that timeline? Is this like a world in which this apprenticeship starts as onboarding classes for open source, even if we sort of magic away the issue of compensation, where people are compensated for the time. If you want to make a living doing open source, you can do so. And maybe you're not going to be, capital W wealthy, but, you'll be able to earn a living wage doing so. Is that sort of the entry point? I mean, I don't know that much about how apprenticeship really worked back in the day. But what does this alternate reality look like, where there's a scalable model for onboarding people into open source that doesn't end up in the trap of maintainers only have 24 hours in the day, and they need to spend a bunch of them working and a bunch of them sleeping and a bunch of them on personal whatever. And where do they also have time to handhold 1 million people?
I think part of what you would see is, so when you think about carpentry or athletics or music, generally there's a wide bunch of, I think of open source, if two different people say, oh, I'm learning the guitar or I play the guitar, you don't really know the context in which they play the guitar. Are they playing it for themselves to amuse themselves? Are they in a band that actually tours? Are they a teacher? Are they, are they writing a song for a specific, company project or something like that? So in open source as well, the projects that get a tremendous number of views and stuff like that, we have right now an assumption that every single one has the same interface, right? But you don't have the same interface to beginning violin and watching Yo-Yo Ma, right? You don't have the same interface to beginning to do a little woodworking on your own in your garage versus watching a master wood sculptor or learning to take those classes or something like that, right? And I think that in this universe where I get to wave my magic wand, the people who have different motivations for participating in different projects have appropriate substitutes available. This is kind of just in general, right? You see libraries in the United States become, the branch libraries, the physical locations, they become these substitutes where that's just where a tremendous number of social services happen. So this is where people end up having ad hoc daycare or schools as well, right? That's where food gets administered to hungry people, and that's where music classes happen, and that's where counseling happens, and so on and so on. And so when we had to shut down the physical locations of various schools and libraries during the pandemic, it was terrible because we had monolithed these things, right? And so somewhat similarly, if all these different needs that different people have for learning, for ambition, for entertainment, and so on, if there aren't alternate substitute approaches for them to take, then they're going to end up going to open source projects. I sometimes talk about the ambition taboo in the tech industry, how in general, since we don't have good ways of assessing people's talent in a way that is fungible and transferable from one place to another, you don't have something like medicine where you have the board exams, right? Instead, all we have is sort of, have you ever been the maintainer of an open source project? Have you gotten a contribution into an open source project? Have you given a talk at a major conference? Have you written a book? Have you gotten hired by a company that we think is prestigious? And to a somewhat lesser extent, have you gotten a CS degree from one of these 5 universities? But even that doesn't matter as much. And so if we had, if I could wave a magic wand, there'd be a lot more work being done on how we can do good assessment and how we have other places for people who want to, aim for ambition, for mastery and validation of that mastery that doesn't then have to get possibly, interfere with people who are trying to do work for other motivations. So that's an example, right? And then when I talk about music or athletics or woodworking or something like that, people who engage in lots of different ways end up being on different platforms that act in different ways. And the interfaces for, hey, do you want to join in, are shaped in different ways. I do think that there's a place for instance, if you're a really popular open source project and then people keep knocking on your door, you know what you should have? You should have subsidized assistants who help, right? Why should, if you're in it as a maintainer because you primarily want to be writing features and fixing bugs and reviewing code and stuff like that, then wouldn't it be great if you could have assistants like me? I am someone who can be hired to do stuff like this, to help with the stuff that is not really in your purview. So that kind of work, that is something that companies can do to hire and to help out the projects that they want to help, who are feeling overwhelmed in some way. So we don't have to close it off and make it all a one-way mirror or something like that, right? We can instead adjust not just expectations through certain kinds of platform friction and certain kinds of expectation setting in text and things like that. We can also subsidize all of the helpers, all of the assistants who can help work with new contributors. And there's actually some stuff in my upcoming book about how you work with somewhat lower effort ways to work with contributors who are coming to you with who need a lot of guidance, and maybe you're providing pretty poor patches. This is not an insoluble problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm sorry, that really went all over the place into a lot of stuff.
It did, but I mean there is a lot of stuff, and it's not as strictly easy to sort of like wrap your head around it. I've seen on the subject of certifications, there's certifications for certain parts of our industry. It's like if you want to be a Cisco certified networking expert, then you pay Cisco a whole bunch of money, and then at some point you get a little like diploma that says like I'm not terrible at this job, and you can get this kind of certification for a lot of different things, but they tend to be very industry focused. Like it's like if you want to
very specific to like a particular subset, a particular framework, usually a particular commercial product.
Exactly. Like it's like I know how to administer Salesforce, and I have the diploma to prove it. And it costs me quite a bit of money to buy that diploma, which obviously excludes a lot of people. But there has been sort of talk over the years of if we think of the crafting of software as a trade, like a lot of other building trades. If you want to be an electrician, you have to be a licensed electrician. If you want to be whatever,
doctor.
You have to be a licensed whatever. Exactly. That there's room for something like boards. So that there's a way to independently evaluate people. We have time for one last question. You keep.
I should say that I wasn't thinking of certification. I was thinking that this kind of course would basically be more about you've gotten the skills, and that ideally it would not be something where people would want that certification for their wall. But I recognize that when you set up a course, then there are things that might emerge around it.
Right. One last question. You keep coming back to this tooling built into, and you say the Forge being sort of a generic name for a GitHub or a SourceForge or a GitLab or the sort of the platform of collaboration for software development. This tooling to help identify what needs to be worked on, to mediate communication between contributors to a project, maybe also to capture things that happen out of band. You say, like, what if I have a Slack conversation with somebody and then I need to bring it into the system, or I have some other kind of communication. If these things are built into the platform, then is the fitness of that thing about satisfying most users? And if they aren't built into the platform, then who owns it? Is it just another open source project? Like, how do we not end up with the XKCD problem of like, now we have 15 different competing standards? It's like, I'm going to have one system to tie it all together, and now we have one more system. How do we not end up with that kind of thing? What do we do that's going to drive towards maybe not consolidation into one single thing? That's also bad, a monoculture, but how do we prevent it from just exploding into here's yet another choice in a crowded field of choices? What's going to help sort of guide us in that direction?
Definitely a complicated, architectural question. So
maybe I can constrain a little bit. Go ahead.
So some of the things that I talk about are things that I think are probably pretty easy. They're prosthetics. They're not so much about things like interchange between what's happening on this platform and what's happening outside it. So, for instance, when I talk about things to help people ghostwrite each other's comment replies, right, and save and share their saved replies and things like that. That's pretty on platform, right? And then there's stuff that is much more about interaction and tooling, that somehow might have some kind of API integration with some other thing like Slack and Discord and Stack Overflow and stuff like that. I think that the issue of we don't want to monoculture, but how do we not like fragment too much? I don't see, when I look at just the marketplace dynamics of the industry, it doesn't feel like that's going to be too much of a problem, because there just aren't that many different user types. There's maybe 10, let's say, different user types of different specific shapes of open source software projects, and what kinds of like governance structure and participation structure and prosthetics they need. I would go by, for instance, the Open Tech Strategies Archetypes report here and say, all right, there's just not that many very different, and probably you could find something like 5 like supersets of that and have, all right, this, and much like, people use different kinds of collaboration software for different sizes of organization and for optimizing for, let's say, egalitarianism versus hierarchy. So I think similarly something like 5 different, and as long as there are migration paths from one to the other, people aren't generally going to find that migrating from Forge to Forge is something that they do on like a month-to-month basis. But as long as there's migration paths so that you can say, oh, I've outgrown this, like a hermit crab outgrowing its shell, and now I need to move on to the next one, like going from like Flask to Django, I need to have more complex needs now, I need to move over here. That doesn't feel like too much of a problem. Again, I assume that this talk will be a laughingstock to people in the future who look back and say, like, freeze frame, this is where she said it wouldn't be a problem.
And then narrator, it turned out to be a problem.
Seriously, yeah.
Excellent. Sumana, thank you so much for coming on and for being a part of the Octo Speaker Series and sharing your wisdom with us. It was a pleasure to have you here today. And folks, if you still have questions and want to engage, there's still the discussion thread. It'll be around. Please keep sharing thoughts there.
And I hope to share a bunch of the links and thoughts that I have, some summary of it or something, or possibly even a transcript on my website at some future time.
Fantastic. Yes, I tried to keep up and sort of identify the correct links while you were talking and paste them into the chat. Hopefully I didn't mess that up too badly.
I gave you like this extra game element because this is Twitch, right? Yeah. So I gave you this extra like matching puzzle to play.
Well, we'll see what my score on the matching puzzle is.
No problem.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.